Hi, this is Stephen Dare from MetroJacksonville.com. Thanks for joining us today. Arash Kamiar,
hello,
also from MetroJacksonville.com, and I are joined by Nancy Soderberg, one of the more dynamic women involved in the Jacksonville community. She's a visiting distinguished scholar at University of North Florida, former ambassador under Bill Clinton, and she's been involved with a couple of global initiatives. Recently, she's been appointed, and by recently, I mean August, to our Port Authority, and we're here to talk to Nancy about three things. Drones and their assessment in U.S. policy, the port, foreign policy for cities, and also kind of the projects that you're involved with. Yeah?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us. So, Nancy, you worked in New York developing a foreign policy for Mayor Bloomberg. And I think a lot of people kind of shuffle through life and they don't realize that cities can have foreign policies that are different from the United States. You know, for example, San Francisco had a very different policy about the Contras and the Nicaraguan Sandinistas than the Reagan government. And many cities are kind of following, they've given up on the federal government on greening and following green initiatives. And Jacksonville has no foreign policy.
Well, I think actually Jacksonville does have a foreign policy. We're trying to grow exports. The Jaguars were just in London. We have, you mentioned the port. It's a huge driver of economic growth here. And we export and import a lot from Latin America to Latin America. So much of the economy of Florida in general and Jacksonville depends on exports. If you look at the CSX, the railroad, we take imports and send them all across the country. We're actually west of Cleveland. People forget that. So we are tied to the international community very much here. So Mayor Brown does actually have a foreign policy, and it's to try and push exports and bring jobs here. Most cities around the country do have policies that reflect the interest of their own citizens. And one of the most interesting is a C40 that's run by Mayor Bloomberg, where it connects cities, many more than 40 right now, all around the world to institute climate change in their cities because they're so frustrated with what the national governments, international institutions, the failure to move. So they're really driving that. It's a very powerful movement. There's obviously immigration issues, the drug laws. So there's a lot of autonomy in that. They try and step into the breach when the federal government fails. Sometimes it's just wacky stuff that they want to, move through their own systems. But it's the politics of cities and the international politics of cities are fascinating.
So, obviously we do everything through our port is with other cities and other countries. Most of it is. Yet there's a lot of criticism, especially on our side, on the administration of the port when it comes to dealing with other countries and developing trade. For example, I don't think there are any speakers of any other language besides English involved with the Port Authority administration, and very little outreach. How do you deal with other countries if you don't speak their natural language? How do you deal with their businessmen?
Yeah, obviously an international aspect to those in the Port Authority is important, and I actually think Brian Taylor, the new head of the Port Authority, is going to be terrific. And the language of the world is English. That's not really a big issue. What's important is to get some federal funding to be able to grow that port, which will be an engine of growth.
And by growing, you mean essentially deepening the port?
I do, as long as you can do it in an environmentally sound way, and I think that there are lots of studies going on there, and that's going to be the trick, is to make sure that you do it responsibly.
We talked a couple of weeks ago with Jim Alabiso. You may be familiar with him. But he's saying how what's happening at the port right now, a lot of their decision-making is being based on a study that it hasn't been validated, hasn't been peer-reviewed, and they're deciding to just go ahead without thinking about the consequences of the environmental concerns, but also tourism and the athletics that we could have on the river.
And I spend a lot of time on the river here, and it's one of the absolute treasures that we have, and we absolutely have to preserve it. I think the riverkeeper here, Lisa, is fantastic, and I think the community is going to get together and decide all this. Look at Mayport. Why isn't Mayport a bigger point of tourism? Mm-hmm. That ferry should be a state road. Since when are state roads stop on one end and pick up on the other? And I'd like to see more development downtown. I think Mayor Brown's trying to do that, but it needs stronger investment from the business community and the people. I think that Jacksonville is really on set to take off. If you look at that 2025 vision, the One Spark, the TEDx conference that was here in October 26th, there's so much going on here, and the youth want to just move it forward.
It's very
So
true. I think we do a lot of
I think you're going to see a lot of change.
I hope so. I mean, I think we do a lot of planning in the city, but that's another, and not a lot of execution.
Not a
but
lot of implementation.
Yeah, but that's another topic.
Well, I think it's time, conversations like this help get
They
things
do.
moving.
Absolutely.
What do you think is the biggest thing that outside of the deepening of the port? I mean, like, are there any policy changes or any just, logistical changes that need to happen at the port? Do you need better rail service out there?
Well, they did get, I think, around $10 million to try and get the rail system better connected there. So I think that, there's talk of fast rail to connect the rest of the state more quickly to that. I think that's probably way down the road. It's really a question of deepening it and connecting it to the rail system to disperse it throughout the country more quickly. And here, I think the state needs to prioritize how it supports the ports. We have between 14 and 17 ports, depending on how you count them, and you simply can't have that many deep ports in this state. So it's really Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville that need to be prioritized to have the state more viable. And then, of course, you need some federal funding for it. We lost that vote, unfortunately, and so I think just got to get up and try again.
Now, are you guys looking at the impact of short sea shipping on the ports business?
I don't know, actually. That's the first I've heard of that.
It's a way of canceling out the port-to-port tariffs so that when ships come through, they're not paying a tonnage rate in each of the ports that they visit up the East Coast, which makes a port-to-rail connection like very, very important. But
I'll take a look at that.
yeah, it was passed under the Bush administration. It's part of the law. They're awaiting funding for that. It has yet to be implemented as they're withholding funding from so many of the programs. But, the Maersk engineers that we talk to on a pretty regular basis feel like it's going to be transformative to the business of that port. And, I wonder, what
I'll certainly take a look at that.
Yeah, please do. What do you think, you come from the cities. You went to Vanderbilt, then Georgetown.
Yes.
Then you went to the United Nations, and you were in New York City, and you worked for a couple of fairly well-placed people up there.
My career started with working on 4 presidential campaigns, and then the Senate with Ted Kennedy, and then 8 years with President Bill Clinton.
You worked with Ted Kennedy?
Yes, I did. From
What
85
seems
to
amazing
92.
as he seems?
Yeah, he was amazing. It's really, and we miss him. You'd have a lot more compromise in the Senate today if he were still there. He was a master at reaching across party lines and seeing the big picture, and had been there long enough that he knew how to work the system and the importance of bipartisanship, which is a rare thing. He was also extremely civil to all of his colleagues, even though they could differ dramatically in their politics. He could see through a way to get common ground, and I think people on both sides of the aisle recognize that.
And you're here in Jacksonville now, which seems kind of like an unlikely leap. It's like Paris, Rome, London, Akron.
Well, I do a lot of international traveling, and up in DC and New York, and I run a business that does international consulting, but I love Jacksonville. I'm based here teaching at the University of North Florida, and I think that's a real treasure to Jacksonville, and it really just transforms students. I teach 2 political science classes there, and then I mentor students in careers in public service, and they get internships, and I take them to DC, and they realize that they can play in the big leagues, and then they just are on fire. And I have students that are working in the Defense Department, the State Department, World Food Program, the Peace Corps, Teach for America, and their UNF students usually come with interesting backgrounds locally, or are refugees from the last 20 years of wars. Mm-hmm. If you look at the student population of Jacksonville, they're from Iraq, Yemen, the Lost Boys of Sudan, a lot from the Balkans, mm-hmm. Afghanistan, and they come without the support network that a lot of the Ivy League kids would have, and they can get that at UNF, and it just transforms them. And I'm trying to create a network of students who can mentor the next group. And it's really powerful.
Yeah, I think the complexion of Jacksonville is very different when you get right down to who actually lives here than people assume. I mean, there's this assumption that it's a kind of an older southern place, and you get right down into the student bodies and the neighborhoods, and it's amazingly cosmopolitan and very diverse from
It's
the
both.
nationalities.
It's got the Old South here, which is charming, and the cracker history of it, all of that, and there's still a lot of remnants of the segregation from 60 years ago. But it's also growing and moving and has just an exciting, culture, art. I'm very involved in the World Affairs Council here.
What is
Florida
the World
Forum.
Affairs Council?
It's a jewel of Jacksonville. It's a nonprofit organization that brings first-rate speakers here on subjects ranging from Middle East to science policy to immigration policy, and mostly foreign affairs, but some domestic and science. And it's free, and it's held at the University of North Florida. The website is great. Have a look. And there's also the Florida Forum that brings fantastic speakers here. And the museums, Mocha, Cummer, and of course the river and the beaches. So it's beautiful.
While we're on foreign affairs, let's get into drones. That's what I want to talk to you about.
Okay.
You have a perspective. Obama has drastically changed the way we're doing warfare. He's, I think, about 6 to 7 times more drone strikes than Bush during his administration.
Which is interesting. Most people think this is a Bush policy, and Obama has distanced himself from it. And the exact opposite is.
Is this Obama's way of making him seem like a non-warfare president?
No, not at all. I mean, it's very much a tactic of war, but it saves American lives, and you have to put it in perspective of what the goal of it is. This technology developed since the early 1990s. I was actually in the White House when it began, and we were saying, wow, this is an extraordinary tool. It was very controversial until 9/11, and then its use just took off. And what Obama has found is it's useful in targeting terrorists hiding out in their own places, so you don't have to send U.S. commandos to get them. The problem with drones is that they are not keeping up with the standards and norms and international procedures. For instance, we killed an American in Yemen, an American citizen in Yemen, who was no question a direct threat to us, but is that right? Why doesn't an American have a right to a trial? So we also aren't paying compensation adequately in cases where we target civilians. We're still hitting too many. There's some very powerful testimony that was in Congress recently with some kids who watched their grandmother get blown up. I mean, there's some fixes that need to be instituted, and I think there needs to be more oversight of this.
Well, you had mentioned the legal context. So outside of compensation for innocence, and like what else would be important to implement?
Well, first of all, I think the CIA should not be in the business of running operational programs like this. They're an intelligence gathering agency. They should not be a war making, so it should shift over to the Pentagon. There should be congressional oversight about who is in the scope of these, particularly the question of American citizens. There's not been really any decision by Congress on that. And the question of territorial rights internally. Do we get the Pakistanis' authority? What if they say no? Do we have the authority to do that? It depends on how lethal that target is. If we see a group of terrorists planning another 9/11, people are going to go get them. And I think the American people would support that. It's when there's sloppy intelligence and you're targeting who you think is a terrorist, and it ends up being a wedding party or a journalist or a grandmother. So there needs to be a broader discussion in the American public, including in Congress, of what is the appropriate policy, who makes the decision, and how do you ensure that there are as few civilians affected as possible?
Outside of that, does this make war too easy? When you don't have the calculated life risk on our side, you can just strike, and our biggest threat is a robot goes down. Does that put us in a situation where we can just easily go to war without really having to think through cost?
I think the risk of that is very unrealistic. I think that President Obama takes it very seriously.
Obama might, but what about?
Well, what about President Palin? I mean,
that's where I think the Congress really does need to weigh in on this, because it shouldn't just be the president. And I do think that the international laws, when you're dealing with unmanned vehicles crossing territory and with lethal powers, there needs to have the international norms catch up with that. There's also an impact. There's studies now that show that the post-traumatic stress syndrome that you see from soldiers being in, Afghanistan and Iraq and multiple tours.
It's actually higher, right?
It's extraordinary. They basically, the drama of going into a room somewhere, killing people during the day, and then going home and putting your children at night is traumatizing these soldiers.
Right.
So it's a new capability that is extremely useful to the United States when we're targeted by individuals who in the internet age can affect us. But I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that it is by rules of the road, that they're not unlimited powers here, that Americans are not part of that process, and that we use it very, very selectively.
I was confronted because, several of our readers, have said that you're pro-drones, and you are, but you are for creating some parameters within which they're used. And I think that's something everybody can agree on. Whether you're for drones or whether you're against them, there should be some parameters. And right now, there's no real conversation in the American public, although, obviously it's being debated by law professors and politicians.
Well, it's starting though. I mean, Congress had these children who had watched their grandmother in October come to the Congress and talk about it. There were two human rights reports, and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International put out an effort to try and track down the civilian casualties. It's very hard because there's very little public information out here, and I think public debate on these types of things are important. I am for drones if it can save American lives and disrupt plots, but done in a legal, responsible way. So if you ask the American public, and I do this in my classes, if we'd had ability of using a drone to get Osama bin Laden after he blew up our embassies in 1998, would the American people have been for that? We tried to get him. We've been trying to kill him since 1998. It took us another 11 years. Most people would answer yes to that. But if there's an American citizen plotting to kill us, do we have the right to go get him? It depends. If he's really a threat to us, the country's divided on whether we do that. So I think it's healthy to have this debate out there.
But we have a constitution on that. I mean, is it really?
Well, and isn't that Constitution based on a belief in the
nobody's
universal
ever-
rights of man?
Yeah, I
Don't
would
we
think
believe
so.
that?
And women too. You got to throw them in there too.
No, just
Yeah.
men. No, I'm kidding.
and also transgendered and people who are neither, and giants. But, if it is, I think war is a lazy diplomacy.
I disagree. I think I've watched presidents decide whether to use force and put American soldiers in harm's way. And no president, Republican, Democrat, ever makes that decision lately.
Well,
And you can disagree with the decisions, but it's the most serious decision that they make, and they look at it very, very heavily. And I think the use of drones is an important tool in American war making, but it has to be done in a legal, balanced way. And I think it's a little bit out of balance right now.
But would you agree with me that war is the failure of diplomacy?
War is many causes to war. Not all diplomacy can stop war. World War II, diplomacy didn't work. And so
Famously.
there was, right. And so sometimes, if you look at, for instance, Syria today, the only reason that President Assad is giving up his chemical weapons today is because we threatened the use of force. And that's a good thing. He's doing it, and we didn't have to use force. There are other complications that come with that. We can talk about that in a minute, but you can't make a sweeping case. Force can, what I learned in watching the wars in the Balkans, for instance, in the 1990s and trying to restore Aristide to power in Haiti is you
Was
had
that as
to back
horrible
up.
as it seemed? Was
Which?
that as confusing, the
Haiti or
Balkans?
the Balkans? Well, it was a thug that would only negotiate faced with the use of force. And it was only the marriage of force and diplomacy that got peace in the Balkans, restored Aristide to power in Haiti. And I think the marriage of force and diplomacy is often necessary to achieve results. I've seen it firsthand. And so it's not always bad if
Well,
you
how
have
can
to
you
use
have-
force.
Excuse me, maybe it's a misunderstanding on my part of what diplomacy is, but if diplomacy is backed by force, that's just force, isn't it?
No.
But we didn't have to use it in Syria. One could argue that we should be using force
Right.
in
The
Syria.
Pax Americana
but-
wasn't based on the fact that we weren't nuclear. Like the 50-year peace following the Second World War wasn't based on anything other than the fact that it was very possible to blow up the world. So I mean, it's based on force. But I think the application of force is, to me,
Different
I mean,
matter.
take these three cases we've just been talking about. In Syria, had Obama not threatened to use force,
Be a different situation.
yeah, and you can argue that the way that all unfolded was not ideal, but and you know, none of those chemical weapons elimination efforts are stopping the Civil War, which has already killed 100,000 people, and on the rate we're going, another 100,000 are going to die. So,
but what's 100,000 amongst friends, right?
well, I mean, it's awful what's happening there, and I think we're not doing enough to end the Civil War there. But if you look at in Haiti, to restore the democratically elected president of Haiti, it was only the fact that we launched the 82nd Airborne to try and basically invade the country that once those planes took off, the junta quit.
Okay.
And similarly with Milosevic in Serbia, we bombed the capital of Serbia for 78 days, and only then the chief negotiator Richard Holbrooke said we have to send bombs for peace, and it worked. So it doesn't always work. Sometimes you can get away with just negotiations, but sometimes you do need to use force in order to achieve a yes at the negotiating table.
Which this may segue us into your initiative, the New Global Impact.
Compact.
Compact.
The New
excuse me.
Global Compact, yes.
A fascinating TED Talk. I mean, just a fascinating
Thank
TED Talk.
you.
One of my
Thank
favorite
you.
ones that happened.
Yeah, for all of your viewers, go to the TED Talk website when it's established. It was a very powerful thing. TED Talks are ideas worth spreading, and it's a global conference that you can go and watch fascinating talks on science and art and culture and foreign policy. And here in Jacksonville, Doug Coleman and his great TEDx team have just held the second TED conference here in Jacksonville, and it's very, very powerful. I had no idea there was such energy and drive
Yeah.
and amazing people that come together with brilliant ideas worth spreading. And you know, we've already connected ourselves and are going to stay there. My idea is that the developing world and the developed world, linked by the new rising middle, have to recognize that in order to be safe and secure, they have to address the others' challenges. So we need to do more to end extreme poverty, clean water, environmental degradation in the developing world, and the developing world needs to do more to address our threats of terrorism and cybersecurity. And if we can do that, and the U.S. has to lead in that effort, then a consensus can emerge which will, you know, transform the international challenges that we all face. So I call it the New Global Compact.
It's almost like you're saying we need the rising middle class of countries. We need a strategy for them, is what you're saying.
Well, we need to work with them to drive these solutions. And they're an amazing, if you look at what's happening in the world today, the gross domestic products of the Brazils and the Turks, they're monumental. And they're 7 billion on Earth right now. America's only 300 million. And we can't solve our problems on our own. We need the rest of the world. The world population is going up to 9 billion by the middle of this century. And the growth is in Africa and Asia, not here. And so imagine how much more we could prosper if we sold those billions. More iPads, more stuff.
How are people responding to your initiative?
It's really powerful. Many people are coming up to me, mostly the younger, saying, well, how can I join? And so I'm going to try and look into establishing an organization where people could have this conversation globally. And that's one of the things of the power of TED. It connects me to ideas of people who know how to have that conversation spread. And I was on a college campus a couple weeks ago giving the talk, and everyone came up to me and said, well, I want to join. What can I do? So they're going to start a chapter, and I think I'm, you know, starting with the universities where the students have that energy and drive to see if I can drive that conversation.
You know, I love the work of Bill Strauss and Neil Howe with their generational theory. And, you know, their position is that the rising millennials are institution builders following the general collapse of, you know, our generation.
We failed, and they're so connected.
And
You
they
know, I'm
believe in
still
it.
learning how to tweet, and they believe in it. They drive it. They do it on their own. They do it on their free time. It just is in their DNA.
Generation
in a
X
way
were
that's
such
gonna
loners, and
take
these
off.
guys are team workers and networkers, and they want to see stuff work.
I see it all. I do a lot of speaking at colleges, and you just see it happening, and it's very powerful. And that's what the TED Talks are fascinating, because it just connects these ideas, and you can see them. And the TED staff works with you to put the idea out there in a much more powerful way by telling a story that you, at least from my experience, have ever done before, and it really works. And it gets the idea out there, and everyone takes that spark and passes it on. So I hope your viewers will go to the TEDx Jacksonville site and look at the talks yourself. They're very, very powerful.
You're such a fascinating and complex person. So, like, you know, and we never pretend to not have opinions on Metro Jacksonville, and I just think that the country would be so much better served with more people like you in office.
I tried that.
Decisions.
I had a great run for the state senate here, and would love to do it again. If I can find a seat that I can run for and win, I would do it in a second. I loved it. It's a very, very powerful experience.
Times change, and people are sick of stupid, you know? And
I
like,
don't know, Stephen.
you're the
I don't
well,
know.
you're the antidote to that, I think. And I just
People
can't
want
thank
solutions.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of negativism in our politics today, which has done nothing but make people madder. And I'm very much of a centrist, where you need to come together and find some common sense solutions. And common sense is not common.
Well, I'm thinking like
And
we're
so we
headed
need
towards
to
a
make that
pragmatic
more-
society. I think we're tired of like these ideologues like fighting for like.
It doesn't work. And
Theories.
I think
It's
that
trench
the risk.
warfare over territory not worth having.
Well, the most recent shutdown of the government, I think, backfired on the promoters of that in a way that I hope will drive some common sense into government, where you need to actually come up with a common sense middle and come around to solutions that actually work, as opposed to cheap slogans that mad people say, yeah, let's do that, but they just make things worse. And I'm hoping that the pendulum will swing back to the middle towards practical solutions that can get the country back on its feet.
Hopefully you'll be a part of that. And thank
so.
you so much for your time.
My
Is
pleasure.
there something that, you know, because we get so involved in our issues, is there something that you would like to say that we just didn't address?
Well, I think get involved. There's so much going on in Jacksonville here that be part of One Spark, be part of the TED Talk next time, go to the World Affairs Council, do the Florida Forum. And there's an amazing conversation happening in Jacksonville, and I hope you'll all be part of it. That's really all I can say, is that there's a lot going on here, and it's fun, it's interesting. They're just an incredible group of visionary people here in Jacksonville that are going to affect change, and I hope everyone should be part of it.
You're definitely one of them.
It's fun.
Okay, guys, we have just had 30 minutes of really fascinating discussion with Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, who is a visiting and distinguished scholar at UNF. Join the conversation. We've definitely been dignified by this one. And you can reach us at metrojacksonville.com. Those of you who are commenting on the forums, I fully expect to hear from you on this. Stephen Dare.
Arash Kamiar.
And Nancy Soderberg. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you very much.